Chosen. Stop whatever you're doing right now. Not in a minute. Not when you find a good place to pause. Right now. Because what I'm about to deliver to you today is not background noise. It's not content you half listen to while scrolling something else with your other hand. This is a direct transmission. A personal report. A confirmation of something that already happened inside you that you may not have had the words to describe until this moment. If this video found you today, understand something before we go any further. This was not random. The algorithm did not accidentally place this in front of you like it places cat videos and cooking tutorials. There is something that shifted in your life. A moment where something inside you refused to cooperate with a version of reality that everyone around you seemed perfectly comfortable accepting. And that refusal, that single act of interior resistance is exactly what this video is about. I don't speak to crowds. I don't chase numbers. This message was prepared for the specific kind of person who has already felt, even if only quietly and alone, that the world they were handed was not the world they were made for. And if you've been carrying that feeling without knowing what to do with it, you're about to understand exactly what it means. Before we go further, I need you to do something simple. Take one slow breath, not a dramatic one, just a real one. Feel your lungs actually fill. Now notice the room around you, the walls, the light, the sounds just outside the frame of wherever you are right now. Now ask yourself honestly, how many times have you sat in an environment exactly like this one and felt like there was something just beyond what your eyes could reach? Something present but invisible. Something real but not quite touchable. That wasn't anxiety. That wasn't your imagination running loose. That was perception, operating at a level the system never intended for you to notice. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on every notification, because what I'm going to reveal about the moment you broke the system that was operating over your life is the kind of clarity that almost no one will say out loud with this level of directness. If you're already subscribed, I want to stop and say something to you specifically. Thank you. You showed up before you even knew what was coming. That matters more than you know. Write 777 in the comments if something in the last season of your life shifted in a way that was quiet, but irreversible. Not a dramatic event necessarily. More like a door that swung shut behind you and you understood without anyone telling you that it would never open from that side again. Stay until the very end, because the most important thing I have to say is not at the beginning. It's waiting for you at the finish line, like a key that only makes sense once you've seen everything that comes before it. I need to start by dismantling something. There's a version of the Matrix that Hollywood gave you. Green code falling down black screens. Bullet time. A man in a long coat choosing between two pills. Forget all of it. That version was safe enough to put in theaters because it kept the real conversation abstract. Science fiction. Comfortable distance. You could watch it, feel something vague and slightly unsettled, and then go back to your regular life without the story actually threatening anything. The real Matrix has no special effects. No dramatic music cue to tell you when you're inside it. It operates through something far more effective than technology. It operates through consensus. The Apostle Paul described it with a precision that should have made it required reading in every school on earth. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Do not be conformed to this world. Do not be conformed. The original Greek word is suschematizo. It means, do not let the mold of this age press itself into your shape. Do not let the invisible architecture of this era form you from the outside in. Paul was not talking about fashion choices or cultural preferences. He was describing something structural, a system of formation so pervasive that most people never notice it because they've been inside it since birth. You don't question the water when you've never seen the shore. This system operates through assumptions, through narratives so widely accepted that questioning them feels like arguing with gravity, through definitions of success, value, identity, and possibility that were handed to you before you were old enough to evaluate whether you agreed with them. That is the real Matrix, not a machine, a mechanism, a collective agreement about what is real, what is possible, what you are, and what you are allowed to become. And it runs without anyone consciously operating it, because it doesn't need an operator. It self-perpetuates through every institution, every social interaction, every voice that tells you to be realistic, to manage your expectations, to accept what you've been given and stop imagining something different. The system works perfectly when everyone cooperates. You stopped cooperating, I don't know exactly when, you might not either. But there was a moment, a specific inflection point in your story. where something in you declined an instruction that you were supposed to follow automatically. It wasn't necessarily a dramatic gesture. It might have been completely internal. A thought you refused to have, an identity you refused to wear, a limitation you looked at directly and said, somewhere in the deepest part of yourself, that this was not yours to carry. And in that moment, without announcing it, without fully understanding what you were doing, you initiated the sequence that this video's title is describing. You broke the matrix. Now I need to show you what the Bible says about how this actually works. And the story I'm going to tell you has been sitting in the oldest book in the Western world for thousands of years, and almost no one reads it the way it needs to be read. Daniel was 17 years old when the most sophisticated system of identity replacement in the ancient world came for him. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had built an empire. And empires are not maintained only by military force. The most durable empires are maintained by controlling what conquered people believe about themselves. When Babylon took over a nation, they didn't just occupy the land, they occupied the minds. They took the most promising young people from every conquered territory and ran them through a systematic program of reformation. New language, new education, new diet, new philosophy, new name. The name change was the centerpiece of the strategy, because the people of Israel understood something that modern psychology is only beginning to articulate clearly. Your name is not just a label, it's a container for identity. Change the name and you begin to change the person. Daniel's name meant, God is my judge. His new Babylonian name, Belteshazzar, was the name of a Babylonian deity. The message was direct. The God you belong to is being replaced by the God of this system. The program was effective, designed by the most sophisticated empire the ancient world had ever seen, staffed by experts in cultural absorption, running on centuries of refined methodology. And then there are 4 words in Daniel chapter 1 that change everything. But Daniel purposed in his heart. But Daniel. 2 words that are the entire difference between someone who gets absorbed and someone who breaks the system. Not an announcement. Not a rebellion with an audience. A quiet internal resolution. A decision made in the only space no empire has ever successfully occupied. The interior of a human being who has decided who they are. He didn't refuse loudly. He didn't make a scene. He asked calmly and respectfully for a different arrangement. A 10-day test. Give us vegetables and water, he said. Then judge us by the results. The system agreed to measure him by its own standards. And at the end of 10 days, he and his friends were healthier and stronger than every young man who had eaten from the king's table. Here is the spiritual law embedded in that result that almost no one talks about directly. The system expected that resistance would weaken Daniel, that choosing the harder path, the path of refusal and internal resolution, would put him at a disadvantage compared to the ones who simply complied. Instead, it did the opposite. The resistance did not just preserve him, it distinguished him. Made him more himself than he was before the pressure was applied. This is the law that operates in every chosen person who refuses the mold. Pressure is supposed to conform. When it meets someone who cannot be conformed, it reveals. It clarifies. It removes what was not essential and leaves behind what is irreducible. You went through the process. The system applied its pressure. And instead of producing a compliant product, it accidentally produced someone more consolidated in their actual identity than they were before the attempt began. That's not a metaphor. That's the mechanism. For those who want to go deeper into the spiritual principles that operate in the lives of people called to break systems, there is exclusive material in the description and the pinned comment. It costs less than a pizza and comes with a complete audiobook and a 5-minute meditation guide as a special bonus. Now I need to talk about what happened immediately after the first break, because this period has a specific texture that almost everyone who lives through it misreads. And that misreading is exactly what the system is counting on to pull you back. When you step out of the mold responds, not with a reasonable conversation, not with acknowledgement that your resistance had merit. It responds with pressure, with social friction, with the sudden withdrawal of things that seemed stable, with the implication delivered through 100 indirect channels that something is wrong with you for not fitting the shape that everyone else managed to fit. You probably experienced some version of this. Maybe it was the moment when you began to see something clearly that the people around you refused to see. And instead of curiosity or gratitude, what you received was distance. The unspoken message that your clarity was inconvenient, that your refusal to pretend you didn't see what you saw, made the people who needed to keep pretending uncomfortable. Maybe it was the loneliness, that very specific kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being physically alone. The loneliness of operating at a level of perception that the people closest to you don't share, where the conversation you need doesn't exist in any room you have access to. Maybe it was the self-doubt that arrived exactly when the external resistance peaked, the voice that used the difficulty as evidence. You see, this is what happens when you step out of line. This is what you get for thinking you were different. All of that was the system testing whether the break was real or temporary. But here's what you need to understand about that resistance. 1 John chapter 4 verse 4. Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. Greater. Not comparable, not in competition. Greater. And notice what John does not qualify. He doesn't say you are stronger when you feel strong. He doesn't say the one in you is greater when circumstances are favorable. He makes a statement about a permanent condition. What inhabits you is greater than what operates in the system. Present tense. Active, not dependent on how your week is going. The system attacked you when you were vulnerable because that's when the attack appears most efficient. But your vulnerability in a given moment does not change the permanent reality of what you carry. When the resistance came at its hardest and you did not ultimately collapse, did not finally abandon what you knew to be true, did not permanently become what the pressure was trying to make you, the attack failed at its central mission. It may have cost you, it may have left marks, but it failed at the thing it was actually trying to accomplish. And you are here, awake enough, aware enough to be receiving this message right now, which is itself the proof. People who were successfully absorbed by the system don't arrive at content like this. It doesn't resonate. It feels abstract at best, threatening at worst. You're here because something in you recognizes what's being said, and recognition is the most reliable evidence that the essential thing was preserved. Now I need to show you what happens in the spiritual dimension when a human being breaks the matrix. And for this I need to go to Ephesians chapter 6 verse 12. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Paul was not writing poetry. He was not reaching for dramatic language to make a boring point interesting. He was describing, in the most precise vocabulary available to him, a layered reality. Structural forces operating above the level of individual human choice. Hierarchies of influence that sustain cultural systems of control. Narratives that keep people imprisoned, not because any single person decided to imprison them, but because there are forces invested in those narratives continuing to operate. The matrix is not just cultural. It has a spiritual infrastructure that maintains it. And when you break with a narrative that was imprisoning your identity, you are not just making a personal decision. You are breaking a structure that had spiritual force behind it. This is why it felt heavier than it should have. This is why the resistance to your growth was disproportionate to the apparent size of your decisions, because the battle wasn't happening only at the visible level. But here is what Paul also says. He says, "Stand therefore, having girded your waist with truth, not with performance, not with the right presentation, with the truth about who you are and what is actually happening." The matrix has power, while you don't know it's there, while you accept its narratives as reality, while you confuse the voice of the system with your own voice. When you see clearly, when you name what is operating, when you refuse the mold with awareness rather than just instinct, the system loses leverage over you. Every time you see and name something that was holding invisible breaks, you've been doing this, maybe without vocabulary for it, maybe without fully understanding the spiritual dimensions of what you were doing. But the action was real, and the effects are real. Now I need to tell you about the specific moment. I don't know the details of your story, but I know the pattern. Because the pattern recurs in almost every chosen person who breaks the matrix, regardless of era, culture, or circumstance. There was a moment where you were looking at a version of your life that seemed almost right. It had the correct shape, the approved credentials, the right people nodding in the right direction. It was what the system had defined as success, fulfillment, adequacy. And you felt that emptiness, not the emptiness of sadness, the emptiness of falseness. That specific sensation of looking at something with all the appearance of right but your interior refusing to recognize it as real. Like biting into something that looks like one thing and tastes like something completely different. Most people at that moment make the choice the system trained them to make. They dismiss the emptiness. They rationalize. They tell themselves they're being difficult, ungrateful, immature. They push the signal down and keep going. You didn't do that. Maybe by instinct. Maybe because you were too exhausted to keep dismissing it. Maybe because the gap between what you were told should be enough and what you knew you were built for became too wide to straddle. But at some point, you honored what you felt even without knowing what to do with it yet. You acknowledged the discrepancy. You held it instead of burying it. That honesty was the crack. Small, invisible from the outside, but real. And a crack in the matrix doesn't need to be large to be irreversible. It needs to be true. Because the matrix is sustained by consensus, by collective acceptance of premises that go unquestioned. When one consciousness withdraws from the consensus, even quietly, even without publishing it anywhere, the architecture has to reorganize around that withdrawal. Jesus said something that sounds simple but is one of the most subversive statements ever recorded. John chapter 8 verse 32, "And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Notice the sequence. You shall know, then you shall be free. Freedom does not precede knowledge. It follows directly from it. The system requires your ignorance, your managed confusion, just enough doubt to prevent you from ever moving, questioning, seeing clearly enough to act differently. When you arrived at any truth about your reality, even the truth that something was wrong without yet knowing what, that arrival was the falling of the wall. And now you are on the other side. The other side is not perfect. It is not free from difficulty or hard days or seasons of uncertainty. It is simply the side where you see. And someone who sees cannot be controlled the same way as someone who is asleep. Let me show you 3 signs that confirm you are on the other side. 3 things you can verify right now in your own life without needing to take my word for anything. First sign, your intolerance for certain conversations. Have you noticed that there are conversations that used to be normal and now drain you in a way that goes beyond simple boredom? Conversations about surfaces, appearances, the maintenance of narratives you know are not true? This is not arrogance. This is not you becoming difficult. This is frequency incompatibility. Someone fully inside the matrix operates at a certain level of reality. Someone who has stepped out operates at another. Trying to sustain deep conversation across that gap requires translation work that exceeds ordinary social energy. The discomfort you sometimes feel about this, which you may have interpreted as a flaw in yourself, is actually a measurement. You can only feel the friction of distance if you have moved. Stationary things don't experience friction. Second sign, your difficulty pretending you don't see what you see. There are situations where you perceive dynamics, intentions, patterns, and the environment around you insists there is nothing to perceive, that you are reading into things, that you are too sensitive or too suspicious, and you experience that specific tension of knowing something internally with clarity that you cannot prove externally, in terms others will accept. This is active spiritual discernment, the capacity to perceive beyond the immediate that Paul references in Philippians. The system needs you to doubt this perception, because perception you second-guess does not protect you. Perception you honor guides you and liberates you. Third sign, your peace that does not make sense. Paul describes it in Philippians chapter 4 verse 7 as the peace that surpasses all understanding. That surpasses understanding. That cannot be explained by adding up the external circumstances. Have you experienced moments where the circumstances were objectively hard, uncertain, or frightening, and in the middle of them there was a stillness you couldn't fully explain? Not denial, not naivety about how serious things were, something else. A quietness that had a different source than what was happening around you. Someone fully inside the system only has peace when circumstances justify it. Their peace is dependent on what the environment reports. Your peace has another source, one that does not require the environment's permission. The system cannot manufacture that. It can only simulate it. And the simulation is never identical to the original for someone who has learned the difference. If you recognize these 3 signs operating in your life right now, you do not need further external evidence. You stepped out. But now comes the part I need you to pay the closest attention to, because there is one final layer of the matrix that is the most dangerous of all. And it's the one that still operates over many people who have already escaped the outer layers. It is the internal matrix. The system is not only external. Over years of operating inside it, you internalized voices that sound like yours but are not. Criteria of worth that feel natural but were installed. Definitions of who you need to be that seem obvious but arrived from outside and moved inward. This internal version is harder to see because it's inside your own mind. Using your own voice. Arguing with your own logic. Using your own history as its material. Have you noticed a voice that appears with perfect timing, right when you're about to grow? Not the voice of legitimate discernment that considers real consequences. The other one. The one that diminishes before you try. The one that surfaces your failures precisely when you need clarity. The one that questions whether you're enough at the exact moment you need certainty to move. That voice is not you. Paul addresses this directly in Romans 7 when he describes the law that operates in his members, working against the law of his mind. He is describing exactly this experience of having patterns inside himself that work against what his deepest part knows to be true and wants to pursue. But watch what Paul does not do. He does not fall into condemnation. He does not declare himself hopelessly divided or too weak to move forward. He goes immediately to Romans 8, which opens, "There is therefore now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus." The internal matrix wants you to condemn yourself for having the internal matrix. It wants the recognition of these patterns to become fuel for more self-attack, more paralysis, more doubt that disguises itself as self-awareness. But the move that breaks the internal matrix is not hating the patterns you find inside yourself. It is simply recognizing them with enough clarity that you stop obeying them automatically. You do not need to destroy the voice. You need to stop confusing it with your deepest and most true voice. When you hear the limiting thought and somewhere inside you register that this thought does not come from what you genuinely believe but from what was installed, you have removed its operational power, not through willpower and suppression, through the clarity of seeing the difference. And this clarity is the second level of what this video's title is describing. You broke the matrix at the first level when you refused the mold from outside. You break it at the second level when you begin to question the molds that were placed inside. And when both levels are addressed, the result is a life that no longer follows the patterns that external systems or internal installed voices determine. It follows something different, deeper, older, more real. It follows what was placed in you before any system had access to you. Jeremiah chapter 1 verse 5. God speaks to the prophet, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. Before I formed you." Before a world with its systems, its narratives, its structures of conformity existed, there was knowledge of you. There was designation over you. The Matrix attempted to overwrite something that was inscribed before it existed. It could not erase it. It could obscure it. It could generate so much noise around it that the original voice became difficult to hear in all the interference. But what was inscribed before the system existed cannot be permanently destroyed by it. You were always who you were before you learned who you were supposed to be. And when you broke the matrix, you did not create a new identity from nothing. You began to uncover the one that was always there, waiting underneath everything that had been placed over it. Now I need to talk about those who did not break, not as a judgment, as context that will help you understand why your rupture cost what it cost. The Bible contains a moment that is the perfect symbol of choosing not to break. When the 12 spies returned from the promised land, 10 of them gave a report that sounded reasonable, measured, the kind of careful assessment that the world calls maturity. We saw the giants. We were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight, like grasshoppers. They had seen the same land as Joshua and Caleb. They had identical physical evidence before their eyes. They were in the same spiritual context, with the same history of deliverance behind them. But the matrix operating inside them transformed what they saw, not into outright lies, into distorted proportion. The obstacles became the primary variable. The promise of the one who sent them became small and questionable. This is exactly what the matrix does with those who remain inside it. It does not necessarily produce obvious falsehoods. It produces distortions of scale. It places obstacles in the foreground and fades or erases what exists beyond them. The 10 spies were probably sincere. They probably described what they genuinely perceived. The problem was not their honesty. It was the filter through which they saw. But Caleb, Numbers chapter 13 verse 30. Let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it. Same land, same challenge, same giants visible on the horizon. But Caleb operated from a different register, not because he had a braver personality, because his principle for reading reality included variables that the internal matrix of the others systematically excluded. You are Caleb, not because you are perfect or without fear, because the principle you use to read your situation has changed. You stopped calculating only with the variables the system allows you to see, and started accounting for what is beyond the immediate. And someone who calculates with more variables than the system anticipated cannot be contained by the limits the system established. Let me warn you now about something that is likely to happen after you absorb everything that has been said here. It may already be happening. It may happen in the hours that follow. When a consciousness breaks the matrix at deeper levels, there is a period of turbulence that is specific and has a name. It is residual resistance. The environment around someone who broke still operates according to the old patterns. The people around you still use the old levers of influence because those are the ones they know, and the ones that worked before. The environment still sends signals that assume you respond as you used to. When you don't respond as you used to, the environment sometimes escalates. It tries more intense versions of the same conformity attempts. It becomes confused by your unpredictability. This will feel for a moment like breaking the matrix made things harder rather than easier. Do not take that bait. The turbulence is not evidence that you made a wrong move. It is evidence that the system registered that you changed and is still testing whether the change is permanent or whether you will return when the pressure gets high enough. Hold. Stay in what you saw clearly. Keep operating from the register you discovered exists inside you. And over time, the environment stops attempting the old levers because enough evidence accumulates that they no longer work on you. There is a stability on the other side of that turbulence that only those who have passed through it can describe accurately. A steadiness that is not rigidity or coldness. It is simply knowing who you are independent of what the environment says you are in any given moment. Daniel arrived there. Caleb arrived there. Every chosen person who faced the turbulence of being incompatible with the systems around them arrived there. And you will arrive there too. Not because it's automatic without any engagement from you, but because you have already done the hardest part. You broke. What comes now is not about having the courage to rupture. That was already done. It is about having the consistency to remain on the side of where you ruptured, even when the pressure arrives to call you back. Chosen. Let me say something that is the synthesis of everything said here. The matrix was never your home. It was a temporary installation that you experienced as permanent, for longer than it should have lasted. What you actually are was always incompatible with it. It was only a matter of time before the incompatibility became unbearable enough to force the break. The pain of the process was not punishment. It was the natural friction between what you are and what the system required you to be. And that friction, as much as it cost, was what confirmed that there was something in you worth preserving, that there was resistance where the system expected total malleability. You did not break the matrix because you found enough courage in some epic moment. You broke the matrix because you were too large to remain inside it. And now that you are on the other side with your eyes open, with the name that was given before any system tried to give you another, the journey has not ended. It has finally, actually, genuinely begun. For those who want to go deeper into the spiritual principles that operate after the matrix is broken, and how to walk with clarity in the freedom that was won, there is exclusive material in the description and the pinned comment. It costs less than a pizza and comes with a complete audiobook and a 5-minute meditation guide as a special bonus. If everything you heard today resonated in the deepest part of who you are, write 777 in the comments to declare that you recognize you were built to operate beyond every limit any system ever tried to place on you. Subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss what comes next about how to walk with clarity in what was won. Share this video with someone you know is living inside a narrative that is not theirs. Someone who feels that incompatibility, but doesn't yet have the language to name what they're experiencing. And before you go, click on the video appearing on your screen right now, because what comes next will show you exactly what was unlocked in your life from the moment you broke what they tried to use to contain you. Together, we are stronger.